Perfect. So thank you, Milan. It was, of course, wonderful, your session in the last symposium, philosophy and mediation. And this one definitely, well, of course, Ken told me that Milan has to be there, part of philosophy and mediation. He's got a lot of things there. And I'm sure here also there's going to be lots. So what we'll do is, of course, you'll have to again tell us about yourself, because it being a different symposium. And then give me a minute, I'll take people through what I'm doing. And after that, totally yours, neutrality and mediation after that. So thank you, Milan.
Well, I want to thank you once again for inviting me. And perhaps just very few things about myself. I'm mediating probably for about 16 plus years. I am here in the United States in Los Angeles. It's about 8 o'clock, and I think we are ready to begin. So first thing I want to say, how do I want to format this presentation? The topic is neutrality, partiality versus multi-partiality or omni-partiality. And there's the main topic, and I want to kind of dissect it to three different portions. The first one is how this topic comes through the history of ideas, specifically in the West. The second topic is the conflict of ideas, meaning that we have two different schools within the community of mediation, and both schools profess slightly different approach. One mostly insists on the concept of neutrality or partiality, and the other one leans more toward multi-partiality or omni-partiality. So we will see, how these two are positioned against each other and create certain kind of disputation or the conflict of conception. And finally, in a good spirit of mediation, the third portion will be about, can we reconcile these two different types of conceptions and ideas, and how that would work. So these are pretty much three different layers, and I will begin with the history of ideas, specifically in Western thought. Well, one of the very important terms which occurs in philosophy, Western philosophy, is the concept of objectivity. And objectivity is played out essentially between so-called knowing subject and then known object. Now, sometimes in 16th and 17th century, the scientific spirit entered the world of ideas in the Western world. And there were two prominent thinkers which I would like to mention. In 16th century, it was a British philosopher, Francis Bacon, who came up with this whole idea of we could say objectivity, or let's just say empirical science. He was probably one of the first initiators of this idea. And that one mostly was focusing on objective world and the fact, scientific facts, and we can speak about empirical approach to scientific inquiry from his standpoint. The second important thinker mostly belongs to the 17th century, and that's French philosopher René Descartes. And Descartes is mostly focusing on the process of knowing, and the quest for certainty, and how do we really attain the truth, and how the knowing subject participates in it. So once again, we have on one side the knowing subject, and on the other side we have known object, and this dichotomy between objectivity and subjectivity is essentially happening in Western philosophy pretty much from the day one. But what is new around the 16th and 17th century is this whole idea of the scientific enterprise and scientific inquiry. What really is happening in a way is the science is gaining its autonomy and prominence in competition with theology. So what we've seen before, it is the advancement of Christianity for many, many centuries, and suddenly in 16th and 17th centuries, the spirit of science is introduced to us. Now, when we are looking at this whole idea of objective spirit, what comes to us is the concept of independent observer. And the word independent is extremely important here, because before, when it was really everything in the hands of God, we were used to the terms like God is omnipresent, God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, meaning that God is pretty much in charge of everything. And yet, the independent observer, in a way, replaced what we would call God, the eye of the God. So it is right now the eyes of the scientist and his independence, which is competing with the eye of the God. And so we have a competition between theology and science, and that, of course, is progressing from 16th, 17th century till today. And that discourse is ongoing, and these two domains are constantly competing, who has, which of them has upper hand. So once we have this whole idea of the independent observer, I want to a little bit bring it essentially within the realm of mediation. And what I want to do is to use a couple of synonyms which we use when we use the word independent. So I will start with unbiased, unprejudiced, or fair. Then the second one is detached, in comparison to be attached. Then non-discriminating, disinterested, impartial or non-partisan, outsider, and then dispassionate. Now, there are many more synonyms, but I chose only 7 of them because I thought that should be kind of enough. But what is important about at least my selection is that there are certain important words which are associated with these synonyms of the word independent. And those are favor, interests, and parties. So we know that what is asked of mediators, that they should not favor anyone. When we are talking about the interest, we like to remind ourselves that mediation is an interest-driven process. And when we are talking about the impartiality or non-partisan approach, we are essentially talking about the parties who are involved. Once again, impartial, partial, non-partisan kind of is associated with the concept of the party. So that's where the independence really coming in, and this is what we are really struggling with. And these synonyms are giving us some idea what we need to really address when we are talking about this whole idea of neutrality on one hand, and let's just say multi-partiality on the other hand. Now, I want to say that my historical approach to what I call the history of ideas is kind of, I want to say non-chronological. So yeah, I started 16th, 17th century, and now I'm going to jump into 20th and 21st century, and I will finish with Greek philosophers, so I will go right back to the beginning of all of it. So let me jump into the 20th and 21st century. Today, we hear a lot about biases. Specifically cognitive biases. And as we all know, mediators are very concerned about the concept of biases. And when I was looking at the Wikipedia entry, it had almost 20 pages related to biases. So it looks like everybody's biased one way or another, and neutrality is almost impossible. It almost looks like. That being said, what are biases attached to are the processes like decision making, belief systems, behavior. We can also talk about the concept of judgment, or judgments or valuation. But what it really doesn't do very well is address the issue of emotions. So I want to bring another very important term, which is the concept of prejudice. I have a tendency to ask mediators, if I have the opportunity, if they make any distinction between prejudices and between biases. And sometimes, they have this kind of puzzling expression on the face because they do not think very much about this distinction, especially because the concept of bias literally took over to a great extent. So I want to go back to the concept of prejudice and mention two important names. In 1954, social psychologist and psychologist of the personality Gordon Allport wrote the book, which is called The Nature of Prejudice. And I believe that this is still one of the best books on the particular subject. But what this really addresses more than the concept of bias, especially the cognitive bias, is that there are certain kind of terms which we need to associate with the concept of prejudice. And I'm going to mention three of them. One is hatred, the second one is disgust, and third one is contempt. Those are profoundly, highly emotionally charged terms, and not very often we associate them with the concept of bias. For sure, we associate them with the concept of prejudice. The second important thing I want to bring about is a German philosopher whose name is Hans-Georg Gadamer. He's a proponent, so-called the school of hermeneutics, and he, in his book, Truth and Method, uses use the term prejudice a lot. Of course, he mentions as much the positive as negatively charged prejudices. But at that time, in 50s and 60s, it was the term prejudice which was dominating the vocabulary, and it was quite strongly replaced by the concept bias, especially in a contemporary kind of lingo and within the mediation community. I want to add another term, and just to make it a little more interesting, and that term is inclination. And I will just leave it there because that might be something, just which can be added. The whole idea about the tendencies and inclinations, maybe we can figure out, how it kind of fits into the vocabulary of prejudices and biases. Nevertheless, I think that both all three terms probably have something to contribute, and we have to be probably cognizant of some of these differences and some of the commonalities. Very good. So, staying in 20th century, One of the most important political philosophers in America, probably all around the place, is John Rawls. And in 1971, he published a book which is called The Theory of Justice. This book probably is one of the most important writings on a concept of justice. And he came up with the term which is called the veil of ignorance. So essentially it comes down to that you have parties who are deliberating on the principles of justice, but to making sure that there are no any kind of biases or prejudices involved here, he said that the parties who are deliberating are behind the veil of ignorance. It's a very interesting term, actually. Now, when he writes, and I'm going to quote him, he said, I'm assuming the parties are situated behind the veil of ignorance when they are deliberating. So what does this really mean, to be behind the veil of ignorance? The first thing which needs to really be said about this conception is that the parties in his case are essentially the ideal constructs. Those are almost, you would say, not real people, but certain ideal construct which he has in mind to kind of create some kind of ideal conception of justice as fairness. And that, by the way, is his concept. It's called justice as fairness. Now, let's just talk about the veil of ignorance. Veil of ignorance and being behind it means that those who are deliberating have to either disregard or not know, choose one of these two, a couple of things when they enter into this deliberation. And so here are about 6 of them, and I will go one by one. They should disregard their place in society, meaning their class position, their social status, their property ownership. They should disregard their endowments such as intelligence, beauty, or physical strength. They should disregard their psychological tendencies and traits, such as being more optimistic than pessimistic, or having certain risk aversion, and their psychological makeup. Their cultural background has to be also disregarded when they enter into this deliberation. Generational membership is another aspect which needs to be disregarded for these participants who are deliberating on the principles of justice. And finally, genetic predispositions. So essentially, you clean yourself of pretty much of all your backgrounds. So when you enter, that you are as objective, when I use that term, as you can be, so that there is nothing which can impact the deliberation to kind of move toward utmostly fair conception of justice. It should not be impaired by any bias, by any prejudice, by any tendency, by any kind of background, by any kind of group affiliation, and so forth. So once again, this is an idea which comes around in the 20th century. And obviously, anybody who is interested in the concept of neutrality or impartiality would say, well, this sounds pretty reasonable to me. Of course, those people who are coming from the other camp, they are saying that this is just absolute nonsense. So, of course, within the philosophical community, there was a long-term discussion, and we're not going to go to that, but I just kind of trying to relate it to mediation, that these ideas are coming from somewhere, and mediators were not the first ones who needed to kind of reconcile themselves with them. Very good. So now we are jumping from 20th century, and we're going to go right back to the Greece, and we're going to go to Plato and Aristotle. unavoidably. So both Plato and Aristotle had a very different approach to concept of rhetoric, or if I should translate it to contemporary language, the art of public speaking. Now, rhetoric, of course, is as old as Greek philosophy and probably many centuries prior to that. But both Plato and Aristotle have something important to say about it. So I will actually start with the fact that we mediators are, to a great extent, rhetoricians. What does it mean? We talk to each other, we talk to the parties, we try to persuade them or convince them about certain things. Like, for example, we try to convince them that they should agree on something, or to come together, to some kind of common solutions or anything what would, be agreeable to them. And we are trying to get them there. So in certain way, we are participating on some form of persuasion. And we are literally, occasionally, are trying to not only convince them, but we have little speeches and we are trying to tell them, why one option is better than the other, or making certain suggestions, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle, depends what type of mediation approach, anybody is taking. Bottom line is, mediators are rhetoricians. So let's go back to the history of Western philosophy. And let's just start with Aristotle. Aristotle was the first philosopher who essentially developed very robust concept of rhetoric. And it has three very important terms. One is ethos, which means credibility of the speaker, meaning that there is certain expectation that the person is a person of a certain kind of character and ethical attunement, okay? He's credible, he's reputable, she is credible, she is reputable. The second one is pathos, meaning that there is certain kind of emotional appeal. It occurs during any kind of speech. The speaker typically is appealing to this audience in certain way and try to kind of emotionally connect with them. So that's pathos. And finally, logos is in contemporary language, we would call the kind of the manner of argumentation. Aristotle came up with, I think, about 27 or 28, topoi is a great word for it, a way of arguing, and I think 9 fallacies. There are many who come after him and try to simplify it. I'm going to mention Cicero in Rome, because Cicero was probably one of the most prominent lawyers. And we know, we mediators know that we meet lawyers every day. So some of us are attorneys, some of them meet attorneys, but the legal profession is definitely not very far away. And Cicero was one of the most brilliant of all of them. He wrote the book on the rhetorics, and he was profoundly influenced by Aristotle. In a more present time, in 1971, if I'm correct, 2 Dutch, I believe they are Dutch, I don't know if I should call them, theories of argumentation, wrote the book which is called A New Rhetoric, a treatise on argumentation. It is, the names are Chaim Perelman and then Lucy Albrecht Taitika. That book also takes a lot of inspiration from Aristotelian conception. So, of course, being good at argumentation is something what is expected of mediators as one of the requirements, especially when we believe that we are trying to, in a certain way, persuade parties to agree on something. Now let's just go right now back to Plato. And Plato is profoundly anti-rhetoric. Plato is anti-rhetoric, and he believes that essentially it is just a form of sophistry, where the people who they will label as sophists are people who are arguing in a subtly deceptive way, and their reasoning or argumentation is not aiming at truth. Rather, they are trying to make sure that they are going to win the argument by any means necessary. Plato absolutely disliked this idea because he's the ultimate proponent of truth, and he believes that these sophists are essentially just trying to play with our minds. I think that that's the right word, playing with our minds. So we can see, how distinct the Aristotelian and Platonic approach is. And I think that I will probably leave this expose to the history of ideas right here. Perhaps very quickly we can see, how it is just moving through the, centuries in Western philosophy. I cannot say, if anything similar is happening, somewhere perhaps, in Hinduism or, in Buddhism or some other parts of the world. But that might be actually pretty interesting, to make that kind of cultural comparison. But for now, I will just stick with the Western thought because that's the one I'm more familiar with. Very good. So, as I mentioned,
and it's going really well, Milan. You really picked up such interesting things. I mean, you've given us lots to think about and discuss.
Thank you very much. Good. So, as I mentioned, my second portion will be so-called the conflict of ideas. Now, there are two people who I have profound respect for, who are participating in this symposium. It is Bernie Mayer and it is Ken Cloke. Both of them have something to offer, and they have their own unique approaches. And I might fairly safely believe that they both are more leaning toward multipartiality and omnipartiality rather than neutrality and so forth. So that being said, because our topic is neutrality and impartiality versus omnipartiality and multipartiality, I want to remind ourselves again that when I was talking about the eye of the God, the word omni was fleshed out on 3 different occasions. And now here we are right now bringing the concept of omnipartiality again and using essentially that word. Now, let's go back to neutrality and impartiality. When we are doing our opening statement, we very often are explaining to the parties what these terms really mean. And probably it is more customary to use these 2 terms rather than terms multipartiality and omnipartiality, just to be paying tribute to people who came up with these terms. Chris Moore, I think, is the one who brought the concept of neutrality and impartiality to the forefront. Ken Cloke brought the concept of omnipartiality, and then Bernie Mayer goes even further, and he's talking about the neutrality as a trap and essentially some form of illusion. So Now, the question is why the neutrality and impartiality are still with us if there is this kind of idea that they simply cannot realistically be sustained. And of course, it's all going back to our conversation about prejudices and biases and tendencies and inclinations and so forth. And in a way, it starts to look that neutrality and impartiality can stand also only as ideals. But the only question is, how far we are from these ideals and why we need to compare them or bring them into discussion with this whole idea of multi or omni partiality. So the last time, Vikram, when you gave me the opportunity, I said I was trying to condense these two approaches to one sentence. So I'm going to again repeat those sentences. And I came up with the sentence for neutrality and impartiality, which goes, I do not favor anyone. Okay. And for multi or omnipartiality, the sentence is, I favor everyone equally. So now what remains to be discussed is, do we want to give up on one of these two terms, or do we want to consider both of them, and why? So I had a mediation many years ago, and as we go along, the attorney, I think it was an attorney for the plaintiff, suddenly in the middle of mediation looks at me and he says, you are favoring the other side, and I absolutely do not appreciate that. Not only that, he takes me out of the room and he says, you understand I can destroy your career, do you? Oh. It went that far. So I was a little surprised by this, and I said, well, I need to consider what you are really telling me. I for sure didn't try to do anything like that. I thought that I was, approaching both parties fairly, and I believe, that I'm neutral and impartial, but obviously you have a completely different perception here. So, I will try to, figure out what it is I'm doing, and perhaps rectify it. So we continued. But then later came to me, especially after I was aware of this disputation between these two schools of thought, that if I turn to this attorney during the mediation in the presence of the parties, and I would say, don't worry, neutrality and impartiality, that's just a trap. That's just an illusion. Don't worry about it. Now, if I told this attorney this, I don't think that he would be very happy. He probably would go with his whole idea that my career has to be derailed. So, so it was very clear to me when I asked myself this question, that we simply cannot discard the concept of neutrality and impartiality. And there are many reasons for it, and I will get to it a little later. But now I want to kind of think about, so what is the purpose of the term neutrality and partiality, impartiality on one hand, and then what is the purpose of multi-partiality or omni-partiality on the other hand? And I came to the conclusion that the whole idea of neutrality and impartiality essentially is connected to the idea of the impaired judgment. So if I am accused of favoring one side, my judgment is not right where it should be. It's not objective, it is not independent, it's not fair, I'm favoring somebody, this and that, and the whole enchilada. So I had to really take that under the consideration, because it was very clear to me that especially people who are coming from the tradition of the legalistic mind and legalistically oriented mediations, they prefer the concept of neutrality and impartiality a lot. And there is another important aspect of it when it comes to the legal process, which is the conflict of interests. And I like these two words coming together because, as I mentioned before, the mediation is considered as the interest-driven process, at least that's what we like to believe. And also the word conflict really is what is in the core or in the center of our practice. So what typically happens when somebody is addressing the issue of conflict of interest? Again, I can go back to my personal experiences. The federal organizations called FINRA, which is a kind of a mediation / arbitration financial investment watchdog. When you take their case, they have about 3 pages, I don't know, maybe 60 clauses, what it is, what you really need to, every time you go to arbitration state for these parties, to clear in their mind that you are not having the conflict of interests. I'm talking probably more than 60. So they really, so I also want to bring it home within the kind of the contemporary disputation in American politics. The Supreme Court has today a little bit of an issue of the perception with the public, their popularity, especially here in the US, is going slightly down. And there is a particular issue with one of the justices, Justice Clarence Thomas, whose wife was in some ways involved in certain activities, which in opinion of many experts, suggest that he should recuse himself from certain deliberation on certain cases. So I'm going to go back once again to the kind of this legalistic framework and say the concept of conflict of interest and recusal is something what attorneys are profoundly familiar with, and they insist that if the process should be fair, this needs to be accounted for. Therefore, they genuinely like the concept of neutrality and partiality. All right, so now, what is the purpose of multi-partiality and omni-partiality? And I came with about 2 different things. The first one is the acknowledgement of the subconscious biases or prejudices which we acquire and not are necessarily aware of. And those impact our judgments, our decisions, and many ways how we go about mediating. Number 2, the conscious acknowledgement of every individual's importance. Almost, I would say, equally. Goes to the term, I favor everybody equally. So this acknowledgement of everyone, their humanity, their importance is something what we mediators need to do when we are dealing with these parties and bring them essentially into conversation. So the very different types of purposes, but it seems to be that both of them make a lot of sense. So once we have that, now we are facing kind of a challenge. let's just say that we realize that there is a utility in both of these terms. And the question remains, can we reconcile them? This is what we mediators do. We like to reconcile. So the third portion of this presentation is about the reconciliation of ideas. Now, I will begin with my probably favorite philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is considered maybe the most important thinker of 20th century, depending who you are talking to. I am biased, so I'm going to say yes. And one of his main maxims or propositions is coming from the whole idea of the pragmatics of language. And it is a fairly simple sentence which says, meaning is its use. And because you, Vikram, mentioned that you are thinking about language and mediation at a certain point, we will be obviously tackling these kind of issues about the meaning of action, meaning of text, and how does that really work within the framework of mediation. So the whole idea of the pragmatics of language is condensed to this sentence, which is meaning is its use. Now, it makes a lot of sense because we already talked about how the community of legal professionals might have their preference to use it. And we might be also thinking, you know, how some other, communities, might be using different term for different purpose. And question is, in a way, who we are talking to, how do we communicate with them, what kind of language do we use, how do we essentially consider them as an audience and also interlocutors with us or who are with us in conversation. And what is really important, can we come to understanding with them so that when we are using certain kind of meanings, essentially that we are achieving the understanding with different kind of people we are talking to. And we know one thing, when we mediate with all kind of people. Some of them are coming from extraordinarily different cultural backgrounds. Some of them are highly educated. Some of them don't know how to write or read. Some of them are very simple. Some of them are extremely, having very complicated minds. And we need to communicate with all of them. And when we say that, what it really means, we have to use certain kind of language which is understandable to them so that they can receive what we are trying to convey. And vice versa, we need to do the same thing when they are really talking to us. Now that we understand that we are, in a way, talking to the variety of people, let's just really kind of come up with a couple of examples which might be useful here. Now, imagine that we mediators, in certain way, are similar to in our conversation with psychotherapists. And psychotherapy, just as mediation, is a remedial practice. Sometimes mediators believe, they are problem solvers. They are trying to remedy, certain disputes or conflicts between the parties. Some mediators even believe that there are healers And psychotherapists for sure believe that they are healers. So imagine that on one hand, you have this practice of psychotherapy, which comes about sometimes at the end, beginning of 20th century. And then, of course, there were different kind of practices which we can find in different parts of the world. And shamanism is one of those practices which we can find almost anywhere we go. Now, shamanism is practiced in places like Korea today, Mexico today, Siberia today. And shamans have essentially a couple of functions, and one of them is literally to heal people. Now imagine that I am having the client either as a psychotherapist or maybe a party, and that person is used to certain kind of practice of healing, and psychotherapy is not one of them. They're absolutely unfamiliar with the lingo, okay? And here I am, and I'm going to impose on them certain kind of language they cannot relate to. I'm probably going to immediately fail when it comes to healing or curing anything, because they simply just do not understand what I'm trying to convey. What they really want to hear is what they are used to. Now, why I'm saying this, because, for example, today in Korea, shamanism is practice which is so established that, for example, if somebody starts the business, that person consults a shaman and pays him extraordinary money to confirm, that he is making right decisions, that the future looks bright, and this and that. So shamanism is not the matter of the past. Shamanism is something what is happening in this world as we know today. Again, it is a curative or healing practice, and the parallel here in contemporary world is either form of psychotherapy and mediation too. Okay. Now that leads us, to our dilemma within the community of mediators, and it goes back to the typical opening statement. So which of these two vocabularies are we going to choose when we are going to explain to the parties why either neutrality / impartiality is important, or why omnipartiality or multipartiality is important? Depends. If we are typically dealing with type of cases which are under the umbrella of the court, meaning the typical civil cases where there is a representation on the both sides, and I mean a legal representation, probably it's going to be much easier for us to go with the language of neutrality and impartiality, because the attorneys are simply just used to it. And they actually not only are used to it, they insist on it. And that's how they talk to their parties, by the way, too. Now, imagine different type of mediation when the relationship is at stake. And this relationship might be fairly close, intimate, emotionally charged, like, for example, at the workplace or within the families. Then using the language of omnipartiality or multipartiality might be appropriate. And yet, once again, we are challenged with ability to comprehend and what is easier to explain. Now, I had the opportunity to offer the vocabulary of omnipartiality and multipartiality to the parties. And at least from my experience, it was a little easier for them to comprehend neutrality and impartiality. I don't know, if that can be rectified or if it is, something what can be, dissected, between types of mediation and between types of relationship. But I believe that that's what really are the determinant factors. Depending on the social proximity, intimacy on one hand, and then institutional framework or situational framework on the other hand. And if that's what we, allow ourselves to consider, then both concepts or both school of thought can contribute, and the vocabularies can be not only utilized well under different circumstances, but they can be useful also for the parties when it comes to how they would be relating to these different ways of approaching it. And I believe that that's pretty much what I wanted to say today. So I think that I'm at the end of this adventure. And thank you again. And hopefully there was something, meaningful I was able to.
Oh, it was wonderful. It was wonderful. You've just started the adventure with all that you have put out there. The adventure begins, and you have to take us through that as we go along. Because I'm saying, look, what you picked up, I think, the core of what we really needed to discuss. And I think the first thing we start with, actually, how do people perceive mediation, or how people want them to perceive mediation? So that, I think, basically starts off, like you said, in certain areas, certain people want this word and they are taking it maybe a little too seriously there. While on the other end, do they really want the word? Do they really connect to it? I think that's on the other side. So I think that's where the whole thing starts. And like I keep saying, mediation is like the word itself is like the elephant and the blind man situation. Everyone's talking about it differently, perceiving it differently. And for that reason, Milan, we have to really go into the history of it. One is the way mediation, of course, exists and has existed. And that's why I had those symposia on mediation in our culture and traditions, indigenous peoples and mediation. So one is that whole mediation which exists and existed without this whole formal setup, because these words come up in the formal setup. While in that setup, I think the word that always comes up is trust. And once that trust is there, these words don't even come up in discussion. So I think that seems to be one connection that, yeah.
Well, absolutely, trust is something what is kind of developing as we go along from the very moment we meet parties for the first time. And we are hoping that we can essentially to get that, to gain trust, and it's a mutual matter. But it is more on us than on the parties. We do not necessarily need to trust very much parties, because they will probably try to a little bit, play with us and try to figure, how to be clever and this and that. But this for sure, they need to trust us. They need to trust us in two different respects. Number one, that we are trustworthy in a way that we are not going to fool them, or that we are morally, in certain way obligated to them, that we are trustworthy. And also that they are confident, they have a confidence in us that we can help them, which would be more of a kind of practical approach or matter of process. So because mediation is a process and it has a couple of stages, usually what is associated with the process is that in an opening statement, we typically have to offer these concepts, to the parties to let them know that that we would like to project something for them. And these words like neutrality or impartiality on one hand, and multi-partiality, only partiality, are the words which are addressed in the very beginning of mediation. So unavoidably.
Because for me, Milan, the thing is that the mediation that I'm trying to promote and where I'm trying to promote is at a point, look, you'll have to look at it from the world situation. Now look at a country like India. We have 60% rural population, and 60% of 1.4 billion people is a lot of people there. And these are
Yes,
people who we really do not even want that they should, first of all, have to go to a lawyer. That lawyer itself is someone for them is still okay. That respect for the profession, how much is there, how much has gone. Oh, that's another whole discussion that has to happen, whether that noble profession is still a noble profession. But if we can
sure,
keep them away from them and the court system, because definitely the access is not as easy as it is in a lot of countries. I keep giving people an example that in some we have states, and states have high courts, and then we have a Supreme Court, and Supreme Court is only in Delhi. Okay, so there's only one Supreme Court. Now there are people who will be 2,500 kilometers away from the Supreme Court. So that's, and you're talking about someone in a village for whom a city, a town, and then to get to a city and then get to Delhi. I mean, it's a whole connection. So I'm trying to promote it at a point where the people who are already, they have the mediator mindset and they are trusted, take it from there. So the first step is already is done, and it's not trying to create trust, it's actually taking people who have that trust. So that's the way I look at it, as to develop it from the grassroots down upward kind of thing, because there is this whole formal concept of mediation which is also being circulated in the world and in the court system, which has gone into the court system in every country, because obviously the courts definitely want it because they're overloaded and they want some release
sure,
from there. So it's developing there. So they're both sides to it, and that's why this discussion is important. One is, of course, in countries like the US, where it's a mature market, as I call it, mature market there, where this box and this word went with mediation to a certain extent, I think, because there also it developed through the court system. So the acceptability of the word neutrality was there, and maybe there was an expectation of some people who might not have understood the process as much, and it was easy for this word to go around. So those people also need to move out of that box. We have to move them out also. But the other
sure,
thing is that because it is something that happened in the US and it now got circulate, that box went around. Now in places and other parts of the world where the cultural differences, I mean, you came up, you spoke about shamanism, and some parts of the world people won't even understand, oh, this does this really exist? Like, you had to say it exists. It exists in India, it exists. These are
of course,
part and parcel of culture here in various parts of India itself. So to be able to, certain people to even connect that these kind of things happen, so that connection between people. So this is really, I mean, really important the way it goes out, because it's developing some parts of the world. And in that, if it's developing, let's take it in a way where people like Bernie Mayer or Ken, they're having that experience in the US itself, them saying all these things. I mean, them talking about the neutrality trap or omnipartiality, just to say, because of all that experience. So that part is not really going out, because there are few people who maybe who talking about it, while the general, these like these training programs and everything, they've taken that box and they're taking it everywhere. So it's a very important thing that, I mean, what you are talking about, and you've of course given it a much wider kind of a discussion, which of course a lot of people, and like I said, you've given us lots to think about and lots to discuss, and you've given it a direction which is really interesting. But the important thing you've done is, for me, given me ideas for various symposia. We have, of course, trust and mediation, healing and mediation. There are lots of other things we need to discuss around it. So I think that's something which the other things that I was, I mean, looking at was the concept I'm trying to develop it, which you have to help me, and is cultural neutrality. So something there I want to bring out, because culture is, of course, on a broad way people say culture, but culture is a very individual thing, actually comes down to a very individual thing. So for a mediator, that cultural neutrality, I feel that might be important, to be able to connect to everyone, because some people say, okay, with this person you should not do this, is culture wise, you broad base it. With Indians you might not do it, with the Arabs you don't do that. It becomes too broad base, it's too general. But whereas if there are certain very basics which we can connect with in terms of culture, which I'm saying, I'm talking about, I'm saying culture, it's between between people itself, some things you just don't do. as a mediator. Let's just look at it that way. You just don't do in general with anyone. And some things you do in general with everyone. So that kind of thing, can we develop something there, Milan?
Yeah, it's a tricky proposition because, as you said, something is profoundly individual and something is profoundly typified. So, we sometimes talk about the self-interest or personal interest. Sometimes we talk about the other interests, and sometimes we are talking about common interests. And they all kind of intertwine in certain ways. And the question is, how much of a commonality and how much of a difference? So it really comes down to, and I have about 4 different ways, how to approach this in mediation, which is how do we distinguish between 4 different things, which is the personal, the impersonal, the interpersonal, and transpersonal. And there are all kind of labels, and I have some ideas, and I need to polish them a little bit. But those are, the difficulties and challenges which we are constantly facing. And it happens, all the time. First thing which we typically tell the puppies, don't take it personally. Or we can say, don't focus on people, focus on problems. Very impersonal thing to do. And then, of course, the whole idea of an interactive process, which is essentially interaction and communication and even negotiations, is profoundly interpersonal. And then we have a system of beliefs, and some of them are believers in God, and some of us are not. And there's a transpersonal, something what transcends us. So all these things, are coming into play, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. Sometimes we are fully aware of them, sometimes we are not. And they start to kind of mesh together in a very unfortunate brew. So to your point, culture is definitely one of them. This is actually culture is the one, where that brew becomes a strange brew.
Because Milan,
And
yeah, please. No, please, you're saying something. Because the way why I'm putting this across is, look, I connect with people from all over the world. And there are people, I have certain shows where people, when they come in, that's the first time I've met them. And there's a show called In Conversation with a Beautiful Mind. The first time I met them and we've connected. So there is something so basic in terms of connection between people to come down to that point where you can connect without, of course, look, biases and all that, because definitely maybe there's not enough exposure of people to various parts of the world, maybe. Because like I keep giving the example of India, to say Indians, I mean 1.4 billion people, and you put them into one category, Indians. It doesn't work that
yes,
way. So that's why I'm saying that there is some basics in relation to that connection. And I'm trying to use that word cultural neutrality. I mean, you will develop it. Look, I have the practical part of it, how I'll do it, and you people, you and the theoretical part that you will put to it, that will be important, because practically, well, like I'm telling you, there is something so common in relation to connection between people. And is that a neutrality in relation to the culture which I bring in, which I don't know, I'm trying to develop over it. There's something so basic, I don't even think about it. Maybe, look, maybe I don't have biases on these issues because I don't stereotype people. I mean, there's no concept, but I still put people's country against their name, only for the reason that other people have stereotypes on people. So let's get that. I mean, if I put Slovakia here, I haven't put it right now, but Slovakia against your name, I asked because I really want people to understand, like, you might have something because you've connected with someone from Slovakia, but meet Milan. Does he even fit into what you thought? That's why it's that way I'm putting it out there. But I also want to remove countries in front of people. It's just people, but I do it for that reason. Well, I'm telling you, there are not enough exposure that people have, because I mean, you could have 8 billion people on the planet, and to say that I've been exposed to every culture, it's never going to happen.
never going to happen. Yeah, we need to account for uniqueness and differences on one hand, and we have to really account for commonalities, because if we do not account for commonalities, the whole enterprise of mediation is actually the exercise in futility. The whole idea of the conflict resolution is about that we somehow can overcome, to at least some extent, this whole idea of the differences and reconcile, the two sides, even if, superficially and temporarily. But if we do not believe in commonality, then whatever we are really doing here probably would not be going anywhere. So that's why I was, talking about, on one hand, uniqueness, and then also and typicality. There is something, that we can connect on, and there are a lot of things we cannot. And the balancing act is, how we can get, how we can reconcile the differences and commonality to achieve something what enables us, as I would put it, to coexist with each other.
Absolutely. I think that's the point. I think the commonality is part of it. I mean, to theorize the theory part of it, of, like I said, you will put to it, because can you really put theories to the commonalities? Because there's so many. I don't know. You can. I'm sure you can. You will do it. Because for me, I'm saying there is this whole, like I said, in the formal structure, you are introduced to people for the first time, and from the first moment, first of all, you have to connect. That has to happen, and you have to take it. You don't have the time to think in relation to nationalities and other divisions that we made in relation to people on color or religion or all those things. You don't even have that opportunity, because you working moment to moment. So that aspect we need to really emphasize. Yeah, you're saying something.
Agreed.
Oh, okay. Because that's a nice simple word to put there. Because we need to put it out. Really, I'm telling you, and only people like you can do it. Put the theory to it and put it out there, because I think those aspects don't get discussed, and the other side of it, in terms of processes, get discussed and stages get discussed, which I'm telling you, in terms of that moment to moment, has really no relevance for me, because it is such a dynamic concept. And in that dynamic concept, to even put it down on every part where I am on this whole series of events where I have to go, I don't think it's
Exactly.
possible. I really don't feel it's possible. So the other topic that has come to me is, of course, healing and mediation, trust and mediation. What else? Something interesting things have come out from what you've said. I'm going to.
Well, when you will be reviewing this, I'm sure it will come to you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm saying there's lots to discuss. There's lots to discuss, and that was the whole idea, that let's have discussions on these topics which don't get normally discussed. So I think, so I mean, it's really been really useful, and I'm sure a lot of people will have lots to contribute to it as we go along, and we would need your, of course, inputs and presence in a lot of events, because what you're bringing in, I think, is really giving it a direction which I also did not know. And I mean, when I put the topic out, I also did not know where it's going to go. Let me put out the poster of it, and then that was Desmond Tutu said. I started with that. And that also was discussed yesterday. Of course, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. We started from there. And yesterday, of course, like there was Mandy from Greece. She said, she was talking about just the fact of, do you know who the elephant is? Do you even know who the mouse is? And do you really, I mean, can you really look at every aspect of that? And I mean, there also do biases and prejudices come in relation to that? I mean, there are a lot of facts which, of course, she also brought in. So I think there's lots to discuss. Lots to discuss.
Excellent.
Milan, thank you very much. It was excellent.
Absolutely. It was a
And
pleasure.
but if you want to, one concluding remark or anything you want to give, please.
Well, I hope, that, I was saying something meaningful, and I'm hoping, to bring people into the conversation. I generally like to converse.
Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah.
I think that you are doing a good thing, essentially to spreading the gospel of mediation all around the planet. And it's still, I think, a work in progress. The awareness, there is a lot to desire, but we need to stay hopeful, because if we do not stay hopeful, then whatever we are trying to accomplish here probably would not take us too far. So I want to thank you, just, for your contribution, for your effort, doing this, for anybody who's interested. And let's just keep it going.
Because you just look at it from this perspective, that all these words of wisdom of yours would not actually get to people in some corner of the planet who will never be exposed to all that you have been saying. And I mean, of course, you'll have an audience as a professor, you have some small group, but we need to put it out there. I mean, people who never would get exposed to it. And look, the mediator mindset is there all the time, everywhere. But only thing, like you said about interaction, having a kind of a discussion kind of thing, I really, with you, like with Ken also, he likes that concept of the interaction. But I'll tell you why I don't do it. Only because of course, your words of wisdom we have to give you that time to really take us through that, because there are lots that you have put in. The other aspect is, when you get people in, what happens is that it's sometimes not the question part of it. It becomes a little too lengthy, and you people have limited time. So some things what they put across, which for you is you'll pick it up like that. Someone is saying something, one word, you'll know what they're talking about. But then they take about 5 minutes to take you through a very simple thing. And that takes a lot of time. And I value your time and Ken's time and Bernie's time. And I mean, you don't have that much time to go through that. So sometimes I do tell people that you put comments and all in the chat, and we'll take it up at that point of the, I mean, I'll try to simplify it and put it in one word or one sentence, rather than take through 5 minutes of comments. So that's why there's a difference. But we'll have the interactive sessions for sure. This World Mediator Circle that I'm creating, we'll have interactive sessions there. We have these conferences coming up, those are interactive. I mean, those are groups kind of thing. So thank you very much, Milan, for taking out time.
Absolutely.
I know it's a little late for you, I know, but
it's okay.
Because,
great. So thank you again. Take care and continue in this wonderful effort and endeavor.
And if you get time, please come for Ken's session on the 16th. That starts at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So please drop in. Zoom link remains the same. It'll be nice. That's when I would like that interaction. That'll be interesting.
Great.
All right. See you then.
Take care.
Thank you. Really, thank you very much for doing this. Bye.
Goodbye.